I'm Rich Mayo and this is Mach 1 Games. Today I'd like to talk to you about immediacy in a role-playing game. The way that we've designed Beyond the Role-Playing Game uses a novel concept in the role-playing genre, and that is we eschew rounds and turns, and in their place we have a mechanism for sequencing action. This mechanism can work at many levels of detail and granularity, but at the most common level, the one we're going to call the action sequence in the published material, at that level of detail, we give each character a speed at which they translate their hips, which means the speed at which they move their hips forward in a stride back and forth. And the reason why we chose this speed is because it is universal both with movement and with any martial applications that a character wishes to take. If they want to strike somebody with their sword, they have to rotate their hips around, circumscribe an arc, and deliver a blow, and whether that's a cut, which is a cutting motion, or whether it's a quick snap of a bludgeoning weapon, whether it's delivering the point of a spear and moving forward on that attack, or any of those typical attacks that a character is going to make with any sort of power can be adjudicated, can be seen together as part of that hip translation mechanism. So what we are able to do is we're able to differentiate minute differences in characters' ability to translate their hips, give them a move speed, and then intersperse these actions into an action scenario. What this gives us is it gives us something far beyond what something like Dungeons and Dragons or GURPS or any of these other role-playing games were designed to do. It gives us an action sequence that's good for chases. It gives us an action sequence that's good for stealth. It gives us an action sequence that's good for combat, of course, but sports or any kind of activity. So it's very intuitive. So the play bounces around with the GM calling out the name of the character who now has a moment to engage a shift or a translation, so that there's an immediacy to it. So the character can take a couple of strides, they can make an attack with their sword, they can use up to 3 effort tokens whenever their character is active. Any tokens that they do not use can be used for reactions that happen before they get called again, resetting them to their 3 tokens. So there's very little to remember, very little to learn as you engage in this mode of play. Your character's name will be called, you'll be asked what you're doing, or normally what the GM will do is she will just preface your name as part of a sentence, and you pick up that sentence and complete your action, resolve it if necessary by rolling the dice, and then the GM continues to narrate the actions of the other characters, and the play ping-pongs around the table, situations develop, and players and characters react to the unfolding drama at the table. And this is very different from what you get with the combat round, this inconsistent thing that we never know how long it is. I'll link to some reasons why that is, where you have this paralysis of your character when it's not your turn. I know when you first hear this, especially at this level of detail, it sort of sounds very similar to a turn. You just getting, 12 turns to somebody's 11, and your name is intermixed with a certain frequency. What you're going to see as you can go into more detail, we can actually peel back the assumption of the translation of hips, and we can look at a character as a player able to declare a number of actions for their characters. We still use the same paradigm of 3, and they take their 3 effort and they can divide it amongst the actions, and the actions, not the character, gets sequenced. And that's why it's not a turn based system, because depending on the level of granularity at which we're looking, the character doesn't have the turn, the action does. Even though you are going to encounter scenarios when the game is being resolved at the character level. Oh, it's your character's turn to act. You're also going to find that at some levels of granularity, we're not going to distinguish between when a character has 12 translations of hip to 11 translations of hip. We're just going to frame it in a task-based scenario and say, what is your character doing? What are the other characters doing? We poll everybody and resolve it as a concurrent lump, and then see what gets resolved, what doesn't get resolved, what complications arise, and we move through it, teasing out the narrative advantages. So I don't want to get too much into this, but I wanted to introduce this concept that action can happen in a very different, unique, and more visceral way. So at the table, when you're doing something, it's very immediate, it's very quick. You can start to think long term as you position your character. You're going to see things change. One of the things that's absolutely fantastic is the ability to create tension. It's not very exciting when a dragon gets its turn and then it rumbles over 70 feet, chomps on somebody and bites somebody else, and then breathes or does a number of things. There's a certain amount of helplessness that creates. There's no intervention of the characters amidst those actions. It's much more pleasing, it's much more organic to have a creature move, and you can see them take some actions that might take some time to accomplish, because perhaps dragon's breath, they have to breathe in, they have to summon that energy and then exhale. So you can see that develop at the table. The dragon's name gets called, and they use 3 tokens to breathe in, for instance, and they might require 2 tokens to exhale, which means you're going to see the breathe in, which is going to give the characters around them the opportunity, or at least a chance of an opportunity, to actually respond to something as they see it happening. You're not going to have characters teleport from place to place. I mean, if there's nobody in between, what's the difference of teleporting 30 feet or walking 30 feet? In the game, it doesn't. In most role-playing games, those don't feel different. Whereas the ability to blink from one place to another in Beyond the Role-Playing Game actually has a huge advantage, because it is so instant and nothing else in the game when you're running an action sequence is. So for sports simulations, for hunting and sneaking up on prey, for subterfuge, for chases, all these kinds of things that we're used to seeing as action sequence and set pieces in movies and art and novels. Well, now they're part of the role-playing experience. So let's take a look at that. And one of the reasons why this hasn't come up before, and it's kind of surprising that other role-playing games aren't doing it, but you got to remember that those role-playing games grew out of war games, and war games had a certain number of assumptions and things baked into them, and those assumptions haven't been challenged. We tend to build by accretion. And what I've done here is I've gone back to first principles, challenged some of these notions, and what it gives you is a very different, much more exciting, much more dramatic, much more flavorful, but equally strategic and equally game-centric. So for your gamers in your group who like to adhere to tight rules, they still have that. You haven't turned it into something that's abstract, and without that abstraction, you have something that's pleasing on many levels and actually can work at many levels. So we have the same mechanism spaced out across time. And don't think that a task sequence can only be resolved with time as its framing mechanism. We can actually frame a task sequence based on geographic